I grew up in several households. I grew up jumping around from home to home when I was very young, what these households looked like, and I didn't know then, but that people would fall asleep on the couch, people would nod out, people would eat a lot in the house, people would be asleep in these homes. And later, what I understood that this equated to people using heroin, people using meth, people using alcohol. And for me, I think the very first time that I touched anything was like about the age of 6 or 7, where I tried to smoke a cigarette in the bathroom with some friends because we try to be cool. I don't think anybody really has, I'd say, a perception of what they're growing up in, right? That's not even a thought or a figment. It's not something that crosses your brain. To me, the individuals that I grew up were my community, right? It was no different. I didn't consider them any type of specific way. But later on, as I, got older, I realized that we were categorized and labeled as specific groups. For me, like all my family members, the majority of them, um, grew up around certain neighborhoods. People would consider this gang culture. I just considered it growing up. But for me, those were the folks that I grew up in, primarily brown. Once I moved to Inglewood, the majority of the population there was black. Um, it was a weird shift. I say that because I was used to traditionally just hearing, Mexican culture majority, and then shifting to like a where we were like the second brown family on the block that we lived in. That was very, very different. But to me, it was interesting. We went into a specific. This is primarily Inglewood at the time. I believe this is like 2010. Sorry, 2000, early 2000s. And there was a lot of racial stuff going on. Me growing up on the west side, there weren't, a lot of, black folk in the west side. And so when we shifted to this area, it was just, it was something new to me. I didn't understand it, didn't necessarily visualize things like that. But just, those were the groups that were kind of going at it at the time. And so for me, it was interesting just to see how people kind of really separated and segregated one another. And it was odd for me because those are the folks I lived with inside the same building. Um, you know, shared food with them, went to each other's houses, and it was so interesting because although like the smells in the house are different of what we were cooking, maybe of some of the fragrances that they wore, the way that just accents, different backgrounds and languages, the ways those things sounded within the household, that was very different. But what was the same was the family unit. It's usually a single mother in the home, no father there, and just kids. And the majority of them were young women with kids. So that's something that I noticed right later on. But growing up, it was just like, oh, these are like me, right? We just have a mom. It was very hard to look to any elders. One, because they didn't exist in the neighborhood, right, where we grew up at. Like the majority of elders, especially coming from a male perspective, although I'm not somebody who quickly puts her hand up and says, I'm a male. I don't like the masculine perspective. But at that age, like there are no adults mainly, rarely any male figures that can give you some positive guidance. Even the female figures that were, in the neighborhood right there where I grew up at or in my household, primarily my mother, um, it was hard to really trust them and to, take their advice because they would tell you one thing and not do it themselves. And so for me, that was very, very difficult, to really trust others and try to take their advice and, let them lead me towards whatever route they thought was best for me. So instead, you turn inward. Uh, I didn't even understand what was going on, but growing up, just, my neighbors, a few people that I went to school with, but really just my neighbors just were like, in a weird way, we kind of understood that, where our parents are full of shit. They don't have it figured out. Somehow we're being pressured to have things figured out. And so what we did is that we ended up finding, some comfort with one another, right? Just being around one another, just understanding that our households were the same, that we can talk and say, damn, my mom's tripping on me again for this. joking about certain things within the household and how we treated our younger siblings and what they cried about. So that to me was how the trust began to be built with others around me. And again, it builds off of what I kind of previously talked about. Um, yeah, we may have started off as a group of young individuals, but then, an older generation comes around and kind of takes us under the wing. And those to me were like my older homies who, you know, they provided some guidance. And at the end of the day, when you would ask them for a favor to, follow through with something, they did. And to me, that was like something that was honorable because didn't exist in the household. They were very transparent about things. They were very, I would say they wouldn't cover things up. They were just honest about, hey, I don't have my things together. Hey, this is what I'm going through. And even though they're only about like 5 to 10 years older than me at the time, to me, I really appreciated that. Somebody that can say, hey, you know what? This is what I'm going through, or this is who I am. And these are the things that I don't know. And so that was very comforting. And that's how I began to build trust with them.